Most people do not stay poor because they never heard about compounding. They stay poor because the amount that would start compounding for them looks too small to deserve respect. That is the first thing I want you to understand. A person looks at $10,000 and feels underwhelmed. That cannot change a life. That cannot create freedom. That cannot compete with a mortgage. That cannot compete with kids. That cannot compete with inflation, layoffs, surprise bills, taxes, repairs, and everything else. Modern life keeps throwing at an ordinary paycheck. So they leave it sitting still. And that is where the real mistake begins. Because wealth for ordinary people rarely begins with a giant pile of money. It begins with a system strong enough to keep your money from rotting in place, a system calm enough to survive your own emotions, a system boring enough that you do not need to become a part-time trader to make it work, a system disciplined enough that your life can stay messy while your money stays organized. That is the real point of the $10,000 threshold. Not that it makes you rich, that it is often the first amount large enough to build an actual machine around. And once you build the machine, the relationship changes. You stop asking only, how do I earn more money? You begin asking, how do I make the money I already fought for stop sleeping through my life? That is the real shift. The source begins in exactly the right place. It does not begin with hot stocks, trading excitement, or some fantasy about outsmarting everyone else. It begins with the insult built into ordinary life. You give 10 hours a day to money, and your money often gives almost nothing back while it sits in the wrong place. Fay file site, Fay turn 60 file 0, Fay, that insult matters. Because if your labor is awake all day and your savings are asleep all year, then the future gets built on only one engine. And one engine is too fragile for the world most people live in now. That is the first mechanism. I call it the leaking bucket. People think doing nothing with money is the low-risk choice. Usually it is just the slow-loss choice. If inflation is higher than what your bank is paying, then your balance is not standing still. It is slipping backward in real purchasing power. It is losing ground politely. It is being robbed by arithmetic instead of drama. That is why I have so little patience for the phrase, I am just being safe. Safe for what? Safe for a month. Fine. Safe for an emergency reserve. Fine. Safe for a near-term purchase. Fine. But if you mean safe for years while inflation keeps chewing and life keeps getting more expensive, then that is not safety. That is passive surrender. The source makes this point directly by comparing inflation with deposit yields and showing that a person who leaves money in the wrong low-yield place can quietly lose real buying power every year. Faithful site, Fay turn 60, file 0, Fay, that is the leaking bucket. And if you do not plug it, then every raise, every saved check, every tax refund, every year of restraint starts getting wasted in a way that feels calm enough to ignore. That is why people wake up 10 years later and feel confused. They worked, they saved, they stayed out of trouble. And yet the money did not grow the way life got expensive. That is not confusion. That is a bad system. Now let me say something even more important. A lot of people hear investing and immediately imagine stress, watching charts, checking apps, feeling sick, wondering if they bought at the top, asking whether this week's headline changes everything. Number, that is not investing for ordinary people. That is self-inflicted financial theater. The source does something useful when it says proper asset allocation should feel more like setting a washing machine than like becoming a day trader. You choose the cycle, hit start, and let the process run. Fay file site, Fay turn 60 file 0, Fay, that is much closer to the truth. The second mechanism is what I call the machine test. If your system needs constant emotional attention, it is not a good long-term system for a normal life. If your system requires you to be brilliant all the time, it is too fragile. If your system depends on calling bottoms and tops, it is not a system. It is a wish. If your system keeps you up at night, you may have built a second job, not a wealth engine. The right structure should reduce the number of financial decisions that require adrenaline. That is what machines do. They remove the need for constant heroic behavior, and that is why the $10,000 number matters psychologically. Not because it is extraordinary, because it is often the first amount where a person can begin to feel the machine. The source says this directly. At $10,000, even a plain 6% return can generate about $600 a year, around $50 a month. And for many people, that is the first time money creates even a small output without new labor attached to it. Fay file a site, Fay turn 60 file 0, Fay, that is not enough to retire on. But it is enough to prove something, and proof changes behavior. That is the third mechanism. I call it the first proof. Until you see money generate anything on its own. Passive income remains a slogan. It sounds nice. It sounds impressive. It sounds like something that belongs to people on the internet and not to you. Then one day a dividend hits, or a balance rises without your intervention, or the account produces a small output while you are asleep, working, traveling, or doing absolutely nothing financial. And for the first time you realize that money does not only have to be spent or stored, it can be deployed. That is a life-changing mental shift, even when the amount is still small, because now you stop seeing the future as a longer version of your current paycheck. You start to imagine a second engine. And for ordinary people, second engines matter more than fantasies. Now let me get to the structure and the source, because this is where the whole thing becomes practical. The source builds around 3 layers. 20% is a safety net, 60% is the long-term growth engine, and 20% is flexible opportunity cash. Fay turn 60 file 0 Fay. That is not just a cute framework. It is emotional engineering. That is the fourth mechanism. I call it the survival stack. A lot of people fail at investing because they think the main problem is choosing the wrong ETF. The main problem is usually that their financial structure gives them no room to survive being human. A pipe bursts, the car breaks, the job disappears, a family emergency hits, a medical bill arrives, the market drops right when cash is needed. Then what happens? If every dollar is fully invested and there is no reserve, the investor gets pushed into selling at the exact wrong time. That is not an investing error first, it is a structure error. This is why the 20% safety net matters so much. Not because cash is exciting, because cash is emotional insulation. It gives you room to let the invested part stay invested. It lets you handle normal life without forcing your long-term plan to pay for short-term chaos. It keeps the portfolio from being treated like an ATM every time life gets annoying. That is not wasted money. That is the price of stability. Now let us move to the center of the machine, the growth engine. This is where people either build wealth slowly and sanely or ruin themselves trying to feel clever. The source puts 60% into broad stock and bond exposure, leaning heavily toward broad market ETFs and a simpler balanced structure rather than trying to guess superstar winners. It also emphasizes that timing the market is not the point and suggests spreading entry over months rather than demanding perfect timing from yourself. Fay turn 60 file 0 Fay, that is adult thinking. The fifth mechanism is what I call the broad engine. Broad engines work because they do not need you to be a genius. They need you to stay in the seat. A broad market ETF owns the productive machine. Not your favorite story, not your cousin's hot tip, not a single personality stock, the machine. That matters because over long periods, great wealth for non-professionals usually comes less from perfect selection than from broad productive ownership kept alive for long enough. That is what the source understands. It is not trying to build a portfolio that flatters the ego. It is trying to build a portfolio that survives ordinary life. And then the bond sleeve matters for a reason that young people often underestimate. Not because bonds are sexy, not because bonds will impress anybody at a party, because ballast matters. A portfolio is not built to win only when life is easy. A portfolio is built to remain held when life becomes ugly. That is why I respect mixed systems more than pure adrenaline systems. The Source S long-term annualized framework of roughly 6 to 8% for the balanced portfolio is useful, not because it promises the future, but because it shows what can happen when moderate returns are left alone long enough. Fay turn 60 file 0 Fay, that is the key. Not how do I get rich fast? How do I build something that keeps compounding while I am busy, living, working, aging, and making mistakes? Now let me get to the most misunderstood part of the entire source, the opportunity reserve. The final 20%, the source keeps it flexible and deploys it when the market experiences a serious correction. It treats that reserve as emotional ammunition rather than dead money, and it specifically frames it as a way to buy when others are panicking. Instead of joining the panic, Fay turn 60 file 0 Fay, that is very smart. The sixth mechanism is what I call the dry powder advantage. A crash is not the same event for every person to the underprepared person. It is terror to the overleveraged person. It is liquidation to the person with no cash. It is a test they are unlikely to pass well. But to the person with prepared reserves and a clear rule, it is optionality. That is a completely different emotional experience. Same market, same headlines, same red screens, different internal world. This is why liquidity can be powerful even when it is not maximizing every possible return every possible day. It gives you the power to act when most people are frozen. And that power matters more than spreadsheet addicts admit, because in bad markets, courage without cash is mostly theater. Dry powder gives courage something to work with. Now let me say something that almost nobody says clearly enough. The reserve does not need to be deployed perfectly. The source uses a 15% drop from peak as a personal trigger. Fine, that is a usable rule. But the deeper lesson is not that 15% is sacred. The deeper lesson is that you should decide your deployment process before the market becomes emotional enough to confuse you. Fay file a site, Fay turn 60, file 0, Fay. That is what rules are for. Not because rules are magical, because they save you from negotiating with panic in real time. Now let me get to what actually destroys most people. It is not the wrong fund. It is not one bad year. It is not even inflation by itself. It is their own judgment. That is the seventh mechanism. I call it the early verdict. The first years of a system never look impressive enough for the impatient mind. You invest, the number moves a little, you wait, it still looks small, you keep going, the improvement is visible but not dramatic, and because the progress does not flatter you fast enough, your brain starts issuing verdicts. Too slow, too boring, not worth it. I should do something smarter. Maybe I should trade. Maybe I should chase that one stock. Maybe I should actually make my money work. That is how people sabotage themselves, not because the system failed, because they judged the system before the system had time to reveal what it was doing. The source keeps coming back to patience, discipline, and the need to avoid reacting emotionally to market noise. That is the right instinct. The machine is not built to flatter you in year 1. It is built to become unavoidable in year 20 if you do not keep interrupting it. Fay file site, Fay turn 60, file 0, Fay. That is what ordinary people need to hear. Your job at the beginning is not to be impressed. Your job is to keep the machine alive. Now let me say something even more important. The portfolio is not your only engine. The source makes one of its smartest points late in the script when it says human capital remains your biggest asset, and that increasing income can accelerate the whole machine dramatically. It even gives the example of someone who starts with the same $10,000, then doubles his salary and can therefore invest much more aggressively, causing the portfolio to scale much faster. Fay file site, Fay turn 60, file 0, Fay. That is the 8th mechanism. I call it the fuel upgrade. A lot of people obsess over squeezing 1% extra from investments while ignoring the much larger power of giving the machine more fuel. That is backward. Your skills matter, your salary matters, your network matters. Your ability to earn more and still keep your spending discipline matters, because a better engine fed with weak fuel still underperforms. This is why the smartest move is often not invest instead of improving your career. It is both you improve your earning power, then you route the difference into the machine, then the machine compounds fast, then the machine starts buying you more choice. That is how ordinary wealth usually works, not one heroic decision. Several reinforcing systems. Now let me get to the word most people misuse. Freedom, people think. Freedom means being rich enough never to work, maybe for some. Eventually, but that is not the first version of freedom most people get. The source ends with the right idea when it says financial management is about building the power of choice. That is better than the cartoon version of being rich. Faithfully cite Fay turn 60, file 0, Fay. That is the 9th mechanism. I call it the choice dividend. A system like this gives you something before it gives you full independence. It gives you less panic, then more reserve, then more room, then more confidence, then more ability to say no, then more power to survive a setback, then more power to act when others freeze, then much later, maybe enough capital that part of your life is genuinely being carried by assets instead of labor. That is how freedom arrives, not all at once, as layers of choice. That is why I like the lazy way framing. Once you strip the clickbait off it, the laziness is not about neglect. It is about building a machine that does not require you to become a financial obsessive to make progress. It is the laziness of systems, not the laziness of drift, that distinction matters. Now let me leave you with the cleanest version of the whole lesson. $10,000 is not a miracle amount of money. It is a system amount of money. It is enough to stop treating your savings like a passive pile and start treating them like the first draft of a working financial machine, a reserve that protects you from panic, a growth engine that compounds while you work, a flexible reserve that lets you buy when others break, a structure that survives normal life, a habit that grows while you are doing other things. That is the real point. If you leave the money sleeping, inflation eats. If you gamble it, your emotions eat. If you systematize it, time starts helping. And once time starts helping, the relationship changes. You are no longer asking labor to carry the whole future alone. You are building a second force. That is what real asset allocation is supposed to do. Not make you feel brilliant, make your life less fragile over time. And if you keep that machine alive long enough, one day the number that once looked too small to matter will be the reason your future no longer looks helpless at all.